What if your government signed a contract, collected the benefits for 10 years, then handed you, the taxpayer, a $3 billion bill to walk away from it? That's exactly what's happening in Australia right now. And the port at the center of it all could reshape the balance of power across the entire Pacific. There's a port on Australia's northern coastline that most Australians have never thought about. It's not Sydney Harbour. It's not the Port of Melbourne. It sits in Darwin, a city closer to Bali than it is to Brisbane, and for decades it was treated like an embarrassing afterthought. A rusting, underfunded facility that the Australian government essentially forgot existed. Then a Chinese company showed up with hundreds of millions of dollars, a long-term vision, and a legally signed 99-year lease. And now, a decade later, Australia wants it back. The current government, led by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, has formally announced plans to terminate that lease held by China's Landbridge Group. If the termination goes through, Australia could be on the hook for up to $3 billion in compensation, money that would come straight from public coffers. And the announcement has already ignited a furious response in Beijing, strained the broader relationship between two of Asia-Pacific's most important trading partners, and raised some deeply uncomfortable questions about how democracies balance economic partnership with national security in a world that no longer separates the two. This isn't just a story about one port. It's a story about trust, money, geopolitics, and the dangerous space between them. It's about how a $320 million infrastructure deal became one of the most contested agreements in the Indo-Pacific. And it's about what happens when the rules of commerce collide head-on with the logic of great power rivalry. Cast your mind back to 2012. Darwin Port was, by almost every available measure, a facility in serious trouble. An independent government audit that year painted a portrait of institutional neglect. Close to 70% of the port's operational equipment had exceeded its serviceable lifespan. Core infrastructure was so deteriorated that engineers were recommending large portions of it simply be taken out of service altogether. Cargo volumes had fallen to around 2.7 million tons per year, a number that told you everything you needed to know about how far the facility had slipped. In port management terms, that's not a slowdown, that's a collapse. The Northern Territory, which administered the port, was stuck in a difficult position. The region is geographically enormous, but has one of the smallest populations of any Australian jurisdiction. It doesn't have the kind of tax base that allows you to absorb billion-dollar infrastructure overhauls. And the federal government in Canberra, comfortable in its southeastern cities, wasn't exactly rushing to fund the revival of a remote port that served a region most politicians had never visited. Something had to give. And by 2015, the territory government made the decision that infrastructure private investment was the only realistic path forward. They put the port out to global tender, an open, internationally advertised process inviting any qualified investor to submit a bid. The response was broader than many expected. More than 60 separate entities from across the world expressed interest. But interest and commitment are very different things, and when potential investors got a closer look at what Darwin Port actually required, many of them stepped back. This wasn't a facility that needed a coat of paint and some new signage. It needed its roads rebuilt from scratch. Its shoreline structures had to be demolished and reconstructed. Storage systems were outdated by a generation. Cargo handling equipment was obsolete. Every layer of the facility's operational foundation required attention, and it would take years of sustained investment before you'd see any meaningful financial return. This was, in the language of private equity, a long-horizon, high-risk play. The kind of project that tests the patience and the balance sheets of even seasoned infrastructure investors. So the question worth asking is, why did Landbridge Group decide this was worth doing? Pull up a map of the Indo-Pacific region, and I mean really study it for a moment. Darwin sits on Australia's northern coastline, facing the Timor Sea. To its north lie a chain of islands. Travel northeast through the Van Diemen Gulf, and you enter the Arafura Sea, which feeds directly into the broader Pacific. Look west, and you're facing the Indian Ocean corridor, one of the busiest maritime shipping lanes on Earth. Darwin doesn't just occupy a convenient location. It occupies one of the most strategically valuable positions in the entire maritime geography of the Southern Hemisphere. For commercial shipping purposes, Darwin is Australia's closest major port to Asia. For cargo moving between Australian producers and Asian markets, whether that's agricultural goods, minerals, processed foods, or manufactured products, Darwin represents the shortest possible distance between two of the world's most consequential economic zones. In shipping, shorter distance means lower fuel costs, faster transit times, and better margins. For a company with deep roots in global trade logistics, Darwin wasn't a charity project. It was a calculated bet on a location with structural advantages that couldn't be replicated anywhere else on the continent. China, as the world's largest manufacturing economy and one of its most active consumers of raw materials, has a fundamental strategic interest in efficient supply chains that reach beyond its own coastline. That's why, over the past 2 decades, Chinese firms have invested in port infrastructure across Southeast Asia, East Africa, Southern Europe, and the Pacific Islands. These investments get described in various ways depending on who's doing the talking, as commercial partnerships, as debt traps, as strategic positioning. But at their commercial core, they serve a consistent purpose: keeping global trade flowing in ways that benefit Chinese businesses and consumers. Darwin fit neatly into that framework, and so Landbridge Group entered the tender process, submitted a winning bid of $320 million, and walked away in 2015 with a 99-year operational lease, an unusually long tenure by most standards, but entirely consistent with the economics of major infrastructure investment, where the payback period is measured in decades rather than years. From the moment Landbridge took operational control, the pace of investment was significant and consistent. In the first 3 years alone, between 2015 and 2018, the company directed more than $180 million into immediate physical upgrades. Roads that had been crumbling were fully repaved. The port's storage capacity was expanded substantially. New loading and unloading machinery replaced equipment that had been outdated for years. Digital management systems were introduced, bringing the port's information infrastructure in line with modern international standards. By 2017, Landbridge was already moving into the next phase. They committed an additional $120 million to construct a specialized refrigerated cargo facility capable of handling 260 reefer containers simultaneously, a critical piece of infrastructure for Australian agricultural exporters moving perishable goods to Asian consumers. Chilled beef, fresh fruit, dairy products, seafood, all of it depended on a cold chain that simply hadn't existed at Darwin before. The transformation in throughput was striking. When Landbridge assumed control of the port in 2015, annual cargo volumes were running at around 16 million tons. By 2024, that figure had nearly doubled to 30 million tons. Darwin had gone from a facility that was struggling to justify its own existence to one of the more dynamic trade hubs in northern Australia. It's worth pausing on the 2024 numbers for a moment, because they tell a complicated story that often gets oversimplified in political debate. Landbridge did report a financial loss of approximately $120 million Australian dollars in 2024. Critics of the lease arrangement have leaned on this figure to suggest the company's operations have somehow been problematic. But the loss needs to be read in context. The global shipping sector faced severe headwinds in that period. Elevated fuel costs, volatile freight rates, and disruptions to several key trading corridors all compressed margins across the industry. Despite the financial loss at the corporate level, Darwin Port's actual cargo throughput grew by 8% that year, exceeding 35 million tons, the highest volume ever recorded in the facility's history. And here's the figure that matters most for the political argument being made in Canberra. Darwin Port generated 1.22 billion Australian dollars in tax revenue for the Northern Territory in 2024. That number represented 17% of the entire region's fiscal income for the year. Not a contribution, not a side benefit, a foundational pillar of the local economy. You can make the argument that Landbridge's corporate finances were under pressure. What you cannot reasonably argue is that Darwin Port failed to deliver for the people of the Northern Territory. The numbers don't support that conclusion. Opposition to the Darwin lease didn't emerge overnight. It has existed in various forms almost since the ink dried on the original agreement. When Scott Morrison became Prime Minister in 2018, the tenor of Australian foreign policy shifted in meaningful ways. Morrison's government adopted a closer alignment with American strategic priorities and increasingly framed China as a competitor rather than simply a trading partner. In that environment, the Darwin lease, which had previously attracted little attention beyond specialist policy circles, became a political talking point. By 2020, the Australia-China relationship had deteriorated significantly. Diplomatic communications were sparse. Beijing suspended imports of Australian coal in what was widely understood to be a punitive response to Canberra's calls for an independent investigation into the origins of COVID-19. In this atmosphere of heightened tension, Morrison's government commissioned a formal national security review of the Darwin Port arrangement. Government ministers gave press conferences. There were suggestions the port represented a vulnerability. The Department of Defense was brought in to assess the 99-year lease from a strategic standpoint. Then the review concluded, and when it did, no concrete evidence of any security risk was identified. The lease stayed in place. Landbridge continued operating. The controversy subsided, at least temporarily. When Anthony Albanese and the Labour Party won the 2022 federal election, trade normalization with China became a genuine priority. Australian wine re-entered the Chinese market. Diplomatic channels reopened. Albanese quietly shelved the Darwin Port review that had been lingering from the Morrison era. And for a period, it genuinely appeared that the political chapter on this issue had closed. But April 2025 changed everything. In a press conference that caught many observers off guard, Albanese formally announced that his government intended to reclaim control of Darwin Port. The justification offered was national security. The language was firm. If private investors couldn't or wouldn't buy out Landbridge's stake, the federal government would use public money to do it. The 99-year lease, Albanese suggested, had to end. The reversal was so complete, so sudden, that it demanded an explanation beyond what the government was publicly offering. Australia's federal election was scheduled for May 2025. In the months leading up to that vote, polling consistently showed the Labour Party in a tight race with the Liberal National Coalition. Albanese was governing, but he wasn't governing comfortably. And in Australian politics, as in most democracies, a close election changes the calculations of even principled leaders. Taking a hard line on Chinese investment, announcing that Australia would reclaim a strategic asset from a Chinese-linked company carries considerable appeal with segments of the electorate that prioritize national sovereignty and security. It projects strength. It positions the government as one that won't be pushed around. And critically, it's a position that's very difficult for the opposition to attack from the right. If anything, the opposition can only say they would have done it sooner. What's notably absent from the public debate is any new security evidence. Australian authorities had reviewed the Darwin arrangement multiple times over the preceding years. Each review had reached the same conclusion. No meaningful threat had been identified. Landbridge had cooperated fully with every inspection and assessment requested by regulators. The company had no documented connections to Chinese government or military structures. Yet the government was now prepared to spend potentially $3 billion of taxpayer money to terminate a contract that its own security apparatus had repeatedly cleared. This tells you something important about the nature of the decision being made. It isn't primarily a security decision, it's a political one. Darwin Port has become a symbol, a way of demonstrating a posture toward China that plays well in an election cycle. Whether that posture is warranted by facts on the ground is a secondary consideration. But it would be incomplete to explain this purely through the lens of domestic Australian politics. Because, there's another actor in this story, one whose presence shapes everything without ever appearing directly in the frame. Darwin Port sits approximately 15 kilometers from a United States Marine Corps rotational base, one of America's most significant military installations in the South Pacific region. That base hosts, among other assets, B-1B Lancer strategic bombers, long-range aircraft designed for rapid deployment and deep strike operations. In any serious U.S. military planning for the Indo-Pacific theater, Darwin is not a peripheral logistics point. It is a central node. In a 2024 Indo-Pacific Strategy Review published by the U.S. Department of Defense, Darwin Port was explicitly referenced as a critical supply and logistics hub for American military operations in the region. The proximity of a Chinese-managed commercial port to a base of that significance was flagged as a concern, not on the basis of any demonstrated wrongdoing by Landbridge, but on the basis of theoretical vulnerability in a contested geopolitical environment. Shortly after that report's publication, Washington extended an offer to Canberra, $300 million US in funding for military infrastructure development across northern Australia. The offer came with an implicit condition. Australia would be expected to regain control of Darwin Port. The logic isn't complicated. The United States wants the assurance that a facility so geographically close to its operational assets in the region isn't controlled, even at a purely commercial level, by a company headquartered in China. Not because Landbridge has done anything to justify that concern, but because in great power competition, perception and control matter independently of demonstrated behavior. Washington doesn't want to be in a position where it has to trust Beijing's commercial interests, even indirectly when planning operations in a conflict scenario it hopes never occurs but must plan for regardless. For Canberra, this creates a genuine dilemma. Australia's security relationship with the United States is foundational. The ANZUS Treaty, the AUKUS arrangement, the sharing of intelligence and military infrastructure, all of it rests on a deep alliance that no Australian government of any political stripe is willing to jeopardize. When Washington signals that it wants Darwin Port returned to Australian control, Canberra listens. That's not capitulation. That's alliance politics. But listening to Washington on this issue comes with a cost. And that cost has a very specific dollar figure attached to it. Let's be precise about what's at stake if Australia proceeds with the termination. Landbridge Group has invested more than $1 billion Australian dollars in Darwin Port infrastructure over the course of its operational tenure. That figure includes the initial $320 million acquisition price, the $180 million in first phase upgrades, the $120 million refrigerated cargo facility, and various subsequent investments in operational systems and capacity expansion. If the Australian government terminates the lease unilaterally, it isn't merely walking away from a handshake arrangement. It's canceling a legally binding commercial contract that was negotiated in good faith, awarded through a transparent competitive process, and that complies with Australian commercial law. Under the terms of that agreement, compensation wouldn't simply cover Landbridge's sunk costs. It would need to account for the projected revenue the company would have generated over the remaining 74-odd years of the lease. Legal analysts examining the agreement have estimated that a full compensation settlement could reach $3 billion US, a figure that Albanese himself publicly acknowledged when he stated that the federal government would use public money if private investors didn't step in. $3 billion from Australian taxpayers to end an arrangement that has delivered reliable cargo growth, substantial tax revenues, and thousands of local jobs. That's the financial arithmetic of this decision. Then there's the economic impact on the Northern Territory itself. Darwin Port accounts for nearly a fifth of the region's total fiscal income in its best years. Any operational disruption during a transition period, which, for a port of this complexity, could last months or years, would have measurable consequences for a regional economy that is already structurally fragile. Projections suggest that a poorly managed transition could reduce the territory's GDP by more than 1%. In an economy as small and dependent on commodity trade as the Northern Territories, that's not a rounding error. That's a genuine hit to people's livelihoods. And then there are the broader legal precedents being set. International commercial law rests on a bedrock principle. Contracts entered into legitimately should be honored. When governments cancel contracts arbitrarily, without demonstrating clear and present harm, without exhausting negotiated alternatives, they send a message to every other potential investor considering committing capital to their country. Australia has historically positioned itself as a safe and transparent destination for foreign investment. It has courts that uphold contracts. It has regulatory frameworks that foreign investors can navigate and trust. If the federal government overrides a legitimately awarded 99-year lease because the political winds have shifted, it undermines every one of those guarantees. Future investors, not just Chinese ones, but investors from Singapore, Japan, the Gulf states, Europe, the Americas, will take note. The implicit promise that Australian commercial agreements are durable will have been broken, and that reputation, once damaged, takes a long time to rebuild. Here's the dimension of this story that sometimes gets lost in the national security framing. Australia and China are deeply, structurally intertwined as trading partners, and that relationship generates enormous real-world value for Australian industries and workers. In 2024, South Australia alone exported 4.43 billion Australian dollars worth of goods to Chinese buyers, a 45% increase on the previous year. China is the dominant market for Australian iron ore, a major buyer of liquefied natural gas, the largest overseas market for Australian wool, and a critical consumer of agricultural products including wine, wheat, lamb, and barley. Last year, Australian exporters sent approximately 97,500 tons of lamb to Chinese consumers, representing close to half of all Australian lamb exported globally. These numbers aren't abstractions. They represent farmers in Queensland and Western Australia, miners in the Pilbara, wine producers in South Australia, and fishing communities across the northern coast. They represent jobs, incomes, and regional economies that depend on continued access to Chinese markets. Beijing has demonstrated on more than one occasion that it is willing to use trade as a geopolitical instrument. During the 2020 breakdown in Australia-China relations, Chinese authorities imposed restrictions on Australian coal, barley, and wine imports. The impact on affected industries was severe. Some Australian wine producers lost their largest overseas market almost overnight. Coal exporters faced a redirection of entire shipping schedules at significant cost. If the Darwin port termination triggers a similar response, and there are people in Beijing who are already characterizing this as a politically motivated breach of contract, Australian exporters could once again find themselves caught in the crossfire. The farmers and miners who benefit most from Chinese market access have very little influence over the geopolitical decisions being made in Canberra, but they bear a disproportionate share of the consequences when those decisions go wrong. It's important to be clear-eyed about the company at the center of this controversy because the public framing often leaves the impression that Landbridge has somehow misbehaved or misrepresented itself. The record doesn't support that narrative. Landbridge Group is a Chinese private enterprise with significant holdings in energy, chemicals, logistics, and infrastructure. When it acquired the Darwin port lease, the company submitted to Australian regulatory review as required. It cooperated with background checks. It accepted the oversight conditions embedded in the lease agreement. In the decades since taking operational control, it has cooperated with every security inspection and audit that Australian authorities have requested. Not a single review has uncovered evidence of the port being used for anything other than its stated commercial purposes. The company has never been accused of providing sensitive information to Chinese government entities. No intelligence agency has publicly presented evidence of covert surveillance activities. No security incident involving Landbridge's operations at Darwin has been reported. What has happened is that the geopolitical context around the company has changed. China-Australia relations have deteriorated and recovered and deteriorated again. The U.S.-China rivalry has intensified in ways that have made every piece of Chinese-linked commercial presence in the Indo-Pacific subject to scrutiny it wasn't designed to withstand. Landbridge is being asked to answer not for what it has done, but for what it theoretically could do in a hypothetical conflict scenario that hasn't happened and may never happen.